would like to introduce the panel and ask you to introduce yourself with your backgrounds and answer a very simple question. We are now 10 years after Bitcoin was basically introduced, and to kind of get the spirit going, I would like you to answer the question: what about in 10 years? Is Bitcoin still around? If yes, what is going to be used for? If no, why not?
Gurvinder Ahluwalia. I'm the founder and CEO of a venture called Digital Twin Labs. I'm based in Dallas. My previous background is from being one of the handful of original arsonists of the blockchain fire at IBM. Yorke knows that very well. And a just longer heritage of helping the industry and clients get used to the change of, let's just say, the last three, four waves of frontier technologies. Daniel, I'm not sure I'm going to make any predictions, and definitely not on Bitcoin.
My name is Yorke Rhodes from Microsoft, and I co-founded our blockchain work about 3.5 years ago, as well as our decentralized identity work. Happy to be here in Davos, talking about the humanitarian issues that we can solve with blockchain. In 10 years, Bitcoin will be decided by all of you, whether it's here or not.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Kamales Lardi, and the last 18 years I have been spending my time basically in consulting with companies like Accenture and Deloitte, and over the last 7 years running my own firm in Switzerland. And I mostly help large organizations understand new technologies and how you can apply it for business. I'm also the founder of Women in Blockchain Switzerland, and regarding Bitcoin, I think I like what's happening now. We've seen a certain stabilization, and my prediction would be Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general will find its space as a coexisting alternative to fiat currency.
I have a microphone. So good afternoon. My name is Timsit. I work at Consensus, where I co-lead enterprise, and I lead our French business. I'm based in Paris, and I also manage the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum, which is an initiative by the European Commission and the European Parliament to foster a dialogue around blockchain policies and regulations in Europe. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. With respect to Bitcoin, I think that Bitcoin, like Ethereum and other blockchain protocols, is an extremely fertile ground for innovation. It's not clear that any of those protocols will exist in its current state in 10 years. But I think what is clear is that the Bitcoin ecosystem, like others, have produced very vibrant innovations lately, particularly with the Lightning Network. Some countries, the Lightning Network is more or less adopted depending on the countries, but I was in Israel a few months ago, and where they are really Bitcoin fans, and they are using the Lightning Network to program games, betting competitions, to applications that allow people to lend computing power and VPN resources to each other. So I think there's a lot happening there, and it's really exciting.
Thanks for answering the question. I'm Jalak, Jobanputra, founder of an early stage fund in New York called Future Perfect Ventures. I launched the fund in 2014 to focus on investing in decentralized technology. About 70% of the first fund's portfolio is in the blockchain sector. The rest are AI and IoT. We're currently investing out of the second fund. We were seed investors in companies like Blockstream, BitPesa, Abra, BlockCypher, and have 30 companies now in the portfolio. We're a partner with the GBBC and the New York EDC on the new blockchain center in New York City, and have worked on a lot of diversity initiatives within the blockchain world. As far as Bitcoin, I've always believed we're going to live in a multi-protocol world and have been looking at middleware and interoperability solutions for a while. To that end, I am still impressed with the developers in the Bitcoin world, impressed by the development that's happening at layer 2. So I think it will be in the mix. If you just look at the last 10 years, right, since Bitcoin was let out in the wild, it's morphed into from a payment system to a store of value. And I don't think any of us can predict exactly what it will be 10 years from now, but I do think it will be around.
Well, I'm the moderator. But I guess it's fair to say I don't think there's any Bitcoin maximalist on this panel. So let's.
Well, I've invested in several, but you know.
All right, good.
By the way, the point that I made was that Bitcoin is for the people, by the people, right? So basically the people will decide whether it's around.
Yeah, but you already in the panel before, you already mentioned the fact that obviously the movement started with this whole view on a fully decentralized setup when it comes to what Bitcoin stands all about, and the original use case, payments and all these things. They don't seem to materialize in the way everybody dreamed about it at the time. And so since I was involved, at least in 2015, we've seen this going back and forth more towards Bitcoin. Then there came the big consortia solutions, and then came other solutions like what we see today. And I'm not sure where we're actually going at the moment. It's kind of, it's not clear to me. And
well, Amazon was a small internet bookseller in 1995, and they now handle a large portion of the internet's traffic. So I think, and this sector is evolving and kind of morphing across the board in a way unlike any other technology I've seen before. So I think it's to be expected when we're in the nascent stages. I mean, we were just talking 10 years is not a long time, and we're kind of impatient about defining things, but we're in the early stages of the development.
Can I just add, I think with Amazon, though, one of the things that they were very good at doing was identifying continuously the value proposition in the market and what consumers want. And they didn't stay with a certain type of function or a certain type of offering, but continuously kept improving as people became more sophisticated in the area. And this is something I'd be looking for as well, that continuous improvement, because the general population is getting more sophisticated as well in this area.
yeah. All right, so let's look at the other extreme, and let's look at what happened in the last few years when it comes to the private or the consortium solutions when it comes to permission blockchains. Also there, I believe it's not quite obvious where we're going to end up with permission blockchains going forward. There was a big hype. I'm a banker originally, so there was this big hype with R3 at the time, and we've seen other things developing. But again, there's not a clear trend. I mean, what is your view on the permission side? Where do we stand there?
Yes, Daniel, that is definitely an area I want to provoke the discussion, and we'll even make some predictions. So one of my main points I want to leave the discussion with, and would welcome the arguments or Q&A around it, is I think it's less important to have a discussion around private versus public blockchains. And it's fine that we are in that framework because that's where we are in the maturity. But I think it's more important to have a discussion around privacy. And if you look at the precedent of other preceding, pioneering, cutting-edge, disruptive technologies, Amazon's been mentioned, which is the cousin of AWS. I'm referring to cloud. And I also come previously from an enterprise, and let me just speak generically from the enterprise cloud side on the notion of a private cloud versus a public cloud. AWS started more as a public cloud. And incidentally, AWS also started in 2008. There were some wonderful things that happened in 2008, as well as some disastrous things that happened in 2008. And so if we say, okay, 2008, but really let's say 2010, 11, by the time people started knowing how to spell cloud and use it in sentences, and quite frankly, we struggled with the definition of a cloud. We today even suffer with the definition of blockchain. But my point being that in our maturity, as practitioners, as leaders, as implementers, as whatever our roles are, it is a normal maturity, it's a normal progression, not a good or bad statement that I'm making, that the distinction blurs. And the distinction blurs because the gaps that previously defined that distinction begin to go away. So for private, back to the blockchain discussion, public and private blockchains, the gap will, and this is the part of the prediction that I will make, that gap will gradually get closed or definitely minimized, marginalized. And the evidence of that is from the progression of innovation from homomorphic encryption, hashing, all of which have existed for some time, and then Merkle proofs, and now you take it into zero-knowledge proofs, right? And by the way, to the point around Amazon took so long, there are multiple incidents, precedents and examples. Zero-knowledge proof was first done by three, four researchers out of MIT, what, 20-something years ago? Ronald Coase, the father of defining the theory of the firm, did his pioneering work in 1930s, and he did not receive a Nobel Prize until the 1970s. It took 40 years for the industry to recognize. So that gap with this progression of innovation around how do you protect privacy will close with the progression of these innovations and techniques.
Yeah, I think that's it's really interesting to look in the rearview mirror and say what happened in the last 10 years and how does that help you predict what's going to happen in the next 10 years. The thing that we have to remember, though, is that this is an open source technology ecosystem, and it, by far, in terms of pace and innovation, is probably the most vibrant open source ecosystem that's ever existed. And so the speed of development that's happening is really driving that gap very narrow very quickly. And that's, I think, where, again, the technology will far exceed the ability of enterprises to adopt it quickly. And so as we try to bring enterprises across this chasm, this concept of a private or a consortium blockchain is basically a tool, right? And so while everyone believes in the qualities of global digital uniqueness, that is a great aspiration and a great capability, but it's hard to get enterprises to believe in that because they've never seen it, right? So we have to actually walk them across this chasm.
So just to add, I think one of the things we have to do is distinguish between permission and privacy, right? There has to be a clear distinction. Permission in terms of who gets to use the platforms, and then privacy in terms of what happens to the data on there. And the second part is actually a topic that I work a lot with large organizations or enterprises, because within an organization, typically what you have is this categorization of information, especially if you look at banks or pharmas that are in regulated environments. And the typical categorizations you get are things like confidential, private, secret, not for distribution. You get quite a range. So if you look at the data protection policies within a large organization, you get these different distinctions. So how do you translate this sort of information into a blockchain environment, and how does that then translate to compliance, for example, settlement finality, for example? How does that translate into how the blockchain will treat the information? And these are some of the key questions that enterprises tend to raise. So one of the first things they do is look at permissioned or private blockchain in terms of a solution where they demonstrate innovation, but on the other hand, they are still staying within that conservative environment where they exist today. So for me, from my point of view, I think the private blockchain is more like a database that's having a facelift. It's not really a huge change from, or it doesn't actually speak to the core of decentralization that the entire blockchain environment wants to go towards, or the original idea of blockchain. But I think these issues that organizations or enterprises face in terms of data protection, particularly if we look at things like GDPR, it's a very important question that we have to try and help them answer. And so the categorization of that information is quite important as well.
Yeah, so great points. I agree with my co-panelists about the gradual convergence between those various technologies, all of which are still immature. We're certainly experiencing that at Consensus. Uport, our digital identity solution, can be deployed on public or private blockchains. Vaient, our supply chain tracking solution, exists now on private blockchains and is going to be deployed on public blockchains. And Doriel, our security token issuance and trading platform, issues tokens on private blockchains and creates a bridge so that if you choose to do so, you can transfer them to the mainnet for long-term custody. So I totally agree with that. I also want to encourage all of you to read the report of the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum about GDPR. I think GDPR is often counterintuitive, and in particular, personal information is personal information, whether you share it with 3 people in a private blockchain or 100 million people on a public blockchain. The harm is, I mean, it's still, you shouldn't do it, basically. So you should protect personal data regardless of the size of the network. And many of the technologies that are used to protect personal data on private blockchains are as relevant on public blockchains.
And I go back to like just the progression of software and moving online and becoming more open, and looking at just a company like Microsoft, right? That so much of your activity right now is open source, and I believe you're predicting that in 10 years you'll be.
You want me to remake the same prediction I made earlier,
yes.
so you can hear it?
Yes.
The question was put to us, to the panel earlier, as an organization, how will you have changed in your adoption of blockchain technologies effectively in 10 years? So my prediction, because it was a 10-year horizon, was a pretty bold prediction, which was we'd be 100% open source software, and that we would be 100% tokenized in our businesses. So.
And who thought we'd see the day where
well, I'm not,
Microsoft
I don't have
would
the title
ponder
of
that.
CEO.
Yeah, I've been investing in fintech for like 20 years now, I believe, and we've seen banks start to open up their data a lot more because the customers have kind of demanded it. The technology's been there, so it's been the cycle of the technology's there. The customers want it to service their customers and retain their customers or attract new customers. They have to provide more maybe not outright ownership of the data, but transparency or portability of the data. That's why companies like Yodlee and Plaid, which just raised a lot of money, exist. They've offered APIs for customer data to banks. And so I just view this conversation as a progression of what we've seen already happen in the enterprise. Instead of these siloed databases, we started getting more connectivity through web with logistics and supply chain, and that was what I was investing in 1999, when a lot of people were investing in pets.com, right, or Webvan. But it was actually the enterprise solutions that could actually get adopted because they were more contained. And yes, they weren't necessarily, I mean, some of them turn into billion-dollar, companies, but I think the attraction is always like, let's jump straight to the consumer applications, and we saw that happen with ICOs. But I think we're going to learn a lot from enterprise usage and adoption, and it'll be kind of more pilots and more contained, but it's going to, permission and the public are going to feed off of each other, I believe.
The open source technology, I guess that's not a question that this is the trend, and that trend is not new. I mean, I'm not a technologist by profession, but Linux is the example of how enterprises got used to the fact that there's an open source technology to be used, and it is, I guess, the standard nowadays in the major corporations now, and this is just a progression of this same trend into the future, and that's why I guess your prediction would be absolutely logical.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to use the Microsoft Cloud as an example, more than 50% of the workloads running in Azure, which is our cloud, are Linux, right? And we happen to own a product called Microsoft Windows, right?
Yeah. Okay, let me be a bit more. I guess ultimately the question is, how do we overcome this problem with open source technology, and especially with more the public side of blockchains, when it comes to getting a bit more speedy when it comes to development of new features, and not just do another fork or not just do another online war on topics that are basic simple topics, and maximalists for Bitcoin versus people that really want to make it scalable. How do we overcome that problem? It's really heartbreaking to see.
Actually, I think the current consortium era, if that's what we're in, actually is instructive there, because consortiums between large enterprises don't happen without strong governance from the beginning. You cannot get 5 CEOs together from large enterprise corporations to participate in a shared compute, shared storage, shared transaction environment without pre-existing governance rules. And so I think the challenges with things like Bitcoin and Ethereum is that there were not strong pre-existing governance rules about what to do in the event of certain situations.
And that goes back to the public blockchains can learn from some of the activity happening in the private blockchains. And I think there needs to be an openness. I think, you know, there's a lot of maximalism, not just Bitcoin maximalism happening out there of, you know, private is bad or permissioned is bad and public is good. But I don't think the public should be paying attention to the experimentation happening on the governance, on the technology, on the permission side.
Will we see what I call blockchain 3.0 or new protocols that are real public developed protocols come to light in the next couple of years that will overtake everything else because they are so super superior to everything we've seen so far? Do you think it's what we're going to see as well?
So, I mean, technology history teaches us that superior protocols do not always win. Superior protocols, especially when they're open source, are recognized for their superiority and then copied and integrated into other protocols that may be more widely adopted. We believe in the size of the developer community as the leading indicator of where innovation is taking place and where developers are able to develop apps. And so I think that's clearly the main strength of the protocols that exist today, which is that some of them have hundreds of thousands of developers currently active, and that's very encouraging.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Developer ecosystem is a leading indicator of success in adoption and long-term sustainability. I think, you know, in terms of how you define 3.0, I think right now we're in the era of layer 2 solutions, which we've just begun to scratch the surface on in terms of capabilities and usage, right? A lot of people have designed a lot of really elegant solutions. There are not a lot of real deployments that are using layer 2 technologies, and I think there's a huge opportunity there to extend the life of existing protocols using those.
So I think one of the threads of your question, Daniel, was what the challenges are around open source in terms of its journey forward. Clearly, we've seen huge success. Linux is always cited as the poster child, even though it came up against Microsoft. And Yorke, you can correct me if I'm wrong. The last I checked, Microsoft, was that? I need a microphone. Yeah. Give him two of them.
Go ahead.
So I believe in Azure, 40% of Azure virtual machines are Linux-based virtual machines.
It's
or
actually more than 50%.
More than 50% by now.
And by the way, Steve Ballmer famously called Linux a cancer.
Yeah. So it's clear, and I think
hence it's not any longer the Ballmer era.
Yeah. So I think there's enough data points that everybody over here know on the massive success around open source. What we do have to, despite the success of open source, be careful about is the governance model, because the open source still does have a governance model, and that's where you do run into challenges. You know, it's publicly reported. I don't know whether Brian is here from Hyperledger or not, and the discussion that is, Brian, are you there? Please tell him I said so. And that is the public discussion that is happening around a supply chain instance of a distribution coming out of Hyperledger from a relationship and experiments that are being pioneered by Intel and one of the agro companies, I don't want to misquote, and that is towards supply chain. And there is this discussion and tension, and perhaps normal in terms of maturity of open source organizations, Hyperledger in the context of what we are dealing with over here, on how that should be handled, because there are 800-pound gorillas that are more on the infrastructure side, and the other 800-pound gorillas are saying, no, it should elevate towards the application side, like supply chain, and that should be part of the Hyperledger distribution. The last point I'll make, and then give it back to you, Daniel, is you also got to look at where there have been quote unquote not as successful, let's just call it, you know, spotty success around open source. And one that I would cite is OpenStack. For those of you who don't know that background, that's an open source cloud infrastructure, which basically was started in order to compete. So if a customer wanted an AWS version like something like that on their own premises, they could take that stack and create it. And if you look at the top cloud providers today, I'm not sure. Azure, I don't know if it's using OpenStack. AWS certainly is not using OpenStack. IBM started very heavily with investments in OpenStack. I was one of the early participants in that movement. But then eventually the acquisition of software left only a very small sliver for storage purposes from OpenStack, and the rest of it was proprietary software. So we got to be careful on where success has been for markets even as big as cloud with open source.
Okay, so I guess you just touched on it. I would like to get a bit more concrete and look and hear from you, all of you, what you think the current most promising use cases out there that is really working beyond, I mean, the Bitcoin payment topic, and what underlying technology there is that is actually supporting this to be real, because I guess it's just fair to say there's so much critical statements in press at the moment that basically go against blockchain. It's just an overhyped thing for the last 5 years and it's going nowhere at the moment. And where do you see the real application today that makes sense and that is basically supported by one or the other of the blockchains out there?
So I can just share about a project that we're working on at the moment, which is blockchain development for palm oil supply chain. And this is working directly with the regulators, basically. And one of the key things that we're trying to address is traceability and the source or origin of the palm oil produce, to address things around not just so looking at environmental issues, obviously, and human rights issues related to that, creating more transparency in terms of where the produce is coming from, is there deforestation involved, are the workers and the workforce legal and well taken care of within those environments, but also then tracing the supply chain across, or tracing the produce across the supply chain as it changes form till the end consumer.
What stage is that project and what
so we are at the beginning stage, so we are starting our proof of concept development. And one of the things we notice is there needed to be quite a significant amount of education in terms of getting the key stakeholders on board, having them understand why this is different from a traditional database and why a blockchain can actually help. The other key element was also around the fear of transparency with these sort of industries where there tends to be corruption as well involved, and there tends to be a lot of black boxes within the processes. And so we're looking at a public permissioned blockchain, simply because I think one of the key things in this industry is the lack of transparency. And so having a public blockchain where the access to view transactions and the access to see the product as it moves through the supply chain is critical.
Which one? Which public permission one?
We can't say yet. I'm working directly with the governments, and so I can't go into details of the actual solution that we're building, but I can tell you about the use case. Yeah.
I think in terms of use cases, that's spot on. I mean, supply chain is sort of the definition of multi-party, verifiable, shared knowledge of the truth. You know, to throw out a few buzzwords that are actually meaningful, that's, you know, what you're dealing with. You have supply chain is not a simplistic thing. It is many parties transacting on the same goods and with documentation and financial flows. And there's a huge opportunity to compress those into a single workflow, and to do it transparently for the public so that consumers can verify, you know, is it organic? What did it come from a particular region? Yes, yeah. So I think that's actually quite a valid point. Is you know, we spent a lot of time talking about blockchain as a protocol. As you saw in the World Bank example earlier, a blockchain solution is part of an entire stack, right? And so there are parts of that solution that mandate that there's certain data that's private to certain parties. And in fact, one of the first conversations that we have with multi-party workflow scenarios is, let's look at a data privacy matrix, right? Forget technology. And I think you mentioned this earlier, right? Data privacy across parties. What's public? What's private to an enterprise? What's private to two enterprises in that particular chain? And where's the stuff get stored, right? And I'll give you just one interesting example about, you know, this point about off-chain, on-chain database versus what is blockchain. I was up the mountain the other day with the WAY organization, which is a bunch of teens getting together for the week. And a 12-year-old asked the question, is blockchain a database? a 12-year-old. So the future is bright. Let's put it that way.
So the question of the use cases definitely depends on who is asking the question. Meaning that there are use cases that are well known now and are working quite well. I will elaborate on that. But probably if you're in this room and you're an entrepreneur or an investor, it makes sense to look at the next wave of applications, given that supply chain and settlement of asset transfers are relatively well known and working as applications. So in the supply chain and asset transfer realm, I would mention Comgo. Comgo is a consortium of around 15 financial institutions in Europe that are using the blockchain to organize trade finance transactions right now for commodity goods. And so this project performed its first live transaction at the end of last year and is now ramping up. And there are 2 other projects that are undergoing final testing on Ethereum before they go live. One is interbank settlement platform in the Philippines that brings together more than 100 rural banks to transfer money. And the other is a project by Euronext and a few financial institutions in France who are using blockchain to create essentially a second post-trade infrastructure to settle trades of mid-sized listed company shares. So those are, again, examples that are working right now and are very promising. But if I had to invest my money now in new applications, I would probably take identity and self-sovereign data as the next big domain. I actually don't think that self-sovereign data is purely a blockchain application. Right? Digital identity exists in some form already, but I think that the intersection of digital identity and blockchain is going to unleash possibilities that we never thought were possible before.
Yeah, so as an investor, I don't invest in projects. I have to see, a business model eventually emerge. Now, most of the time when I invest in a company, we don't know what the business model is, but want to see a path to get there. 2 companies from the first fund's portfolio, which are, have proven out use cases with, beyond pilot and actually productizing. One is BitPesa, which started off using the Bitcoin blockchain just for FX transactions and kind of first with consumer remittances, but now B2B remittances are their biggest business. Started off in Kenya, are now in several different countries in Africa, including Nigeria, have partnered with companies like SBI in Japan to handle their Africa transfers. And so looking at the emerging markets, and I was born in Nairobi, so I was actually drawn into this sector back in 2013 because of the potential I saw in emerging markets, a lot of which have no institutions in place, so can completely leapfrog this whole, consortia trying to disintermediate, businesses that have been around for, 100 years or 50 years. So I'm actually seeing actual applications outside of the U.S. Gain traction. The other is Everledger, which we invested in 2015, and they were the first company I come across that took physical objects and put physical object data onto a blockchain, and they work with IBM to do that. And so this was an industry that was going under a lot of pressure from counterfeits of GIA certificates, counterfeit diamonds, the Kimberley process, which mandates more transparency in keeping conflict diamonds out of the market. So a traditionally opaque industry that needed to collaborate to kind of be compliant in this kind of new world of regulation, and that's where there are a lot of opportunities in financial services also. So that's, as you said, the past. I would say what I'm looking at out of the second fund is one is crypto asset infrastructure. I believe in tokenization. I think we were trying to get there way too quickly. So partnering with entrepreneurs who are looking at compliance, and we're looking at global trade, right? And this is of tokens, and how do we make it more frictionless, and data analytics around tokens, and the second is efficiencies. We know within enterprises, I've made a lot of money over the years for various funds looking at enterprise efficiencies as we move to the web, and I think the same thing is going to happen here, especially, again, as we look at emerging markets and supply chains that are touching areas that don't have infrastructure in place. And the third are like what I consider more of the moonshot category of figuring out crypto economics for different models, right, for different businesses. So what does the next Uber look like? What does the next decentralized Airbnb look like? And what are the right economics in play that are going to be necessary for all the participants? And we don't know that yet. And that's why I didn't participate in any ICOs in 2017, because there was no way to verify whether any of that was actually going to work out in the wild, because you can theorize and you can have economists like papers, but until you unleash something, you have no idea, and a lot of it was on like very shaky territory.
I'm not going to cite more examples, and I think there's enough evidence of what's working. I want to talk a little about what's not working, and I want to talk about it in the context of supply chain. So I'm going to provoke that part of the discussion. Yes, great examples on supply chain, and in fact, I'm humbled and privileged to have my fingerprints on, like the one to do with the IBM case with Everledger, and Leanne, I believe, is somewhere around. But here's the challenge, and of course the Walmart case that everybody's read about, tracking of pork, Walmart case with IBM and other vendors, and Azure, yeah, right, just to keep it balanced. On no, that's not true. That's not true. And that's food, and now increasingly baby food, baby products, right? So, but here's the challenge: the focus is on supply chain, and that's fine, purposefully so. But if you want to address the Chipotle case of chicken contamination, it took 7 months to do that recall. I don't remember the numbers on how long it took to recall the cantaloupes that went out of Walmart and other superstores in the United States. But I will tell you that we have a friend whose fetus was lost because of an infection as a result of cantaloupe. So there are genuine problems. Now, supply chain optimization and innovation using blockchain doesn't necessarily solve recall. They provide you good provenance, that I can give you provenance and visibility into the farm, where it exactly came from and who picked it. And it took 15 days or whatever earlier, and now it takes 4 seconds. Great. But how did I solve the Chipotle problem? So that a baby wouldn't die in the womb. So the thing is, the point I'm making is, I'm interested in challenging ourselves on how do we make the intersection, the interface between the supply and the demand side, and that is the point of sale. If I'm tracking in the supply chain and the demand chain for seamlessness, the supply of these articles at the point of sale, then I know how they've gone out, not just where they came from. But here's the problem. The problem is that point of sale systems, for anybody who's been around it, are very brittle. The schemas are very rigid. Try integrating a blockchain system or any system with an existing point of sale system. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I just was going to make some references to protocols because that was the question you asked. Everledger, as an example, is a Hyperledger project. It's an example of a full stack application, right, built on top of a blockchain protocol called Hyperledger. There is a Xbox Royalties payments project. That's a first-party Microsoft business where we're using blockchain to settle payments with our game publishers who, when somebody plays a game on an Xbox, we have to pay royalties, right? So it's similar to a music royalties type of scenario. That was based on Quorum, which is a variant of Ethereum. The World Bank project is based on Ethereum proof of authority from a company called Parity. So that's two similar examples in terms of protocols. Hyperledger is very different. In terms of where we see Corda being deployed, there's actually a project called InsureWave, which is maritime insurance settlement, which is a complicated, non-real-time, very manual process, and that involves Maersk and Towers Watson and ships and real-time settlement based on ships going into danger zones, and premiums having to change on the fly, and it's quite complicated. So there's actually work going on across different protocols and lots of examples. You just kind of have to look for them, and I think that's what the press is not doing.
That I would like to pick up afterwards, but I'm on the regulation side, and is the regulation actually the big problem to actually get this going with many more of these things, because the regulators still don't understand how to actually regulate smart contract related issues and so forth. But let's open up to the audience if there's any direct questions from any of you, and then if we need to fill it up, we can come back.
So I would like some clarity on the logic behind using a private blockchain outside of the self-interest of revenues coming first from private blockchains. Our company has an application, ADAPT, built, an ICO actually, built on top of a public blockchain. AML KYC system, built specifically for the blockchain, private public key challenge, full privacy, full confidentiality, full permissioning, with the full network effect of the Ethereum blockchain. I don't see an advantage of a private blockchain in that scenario. So help me out.
Okay, I'm a chief information security officer. I want to know how you tell me that it's private. Right.
So we have a chief information security officer, 36 years in Wall Street. He gave it a full okay. And we have the...
So that's it? I get a full okay.
And we have a security audit, two, one internal, one external. Basically the same
process.
process.
Who did the security audit?
Very prominent Russian firm.
Who? A Russian
firm? A very
firm?
prominent Russian
really?
firm.
Is
yes.
this a US-based operation?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Let's not go there, but the basically each and every positive qualifier for the private blockchain we have with our public blockchain system, plus we have the full network effect, and we have the ability to reach a much further audience.
Right.
So I understand the economic reason for pushing a private blockchain consultation.
What are the economic reasons for pushing a private blockchain?
Some people own a private blockchain consultation company. So you sell what you have in inventory, private blockchains. But we've seen this movie before let me
just counter that point. Microsoft Cloud is a platform on which you can run public blockchain, and we get paid for that.
Right. Well,
so I'm not selling private blockchain for
I
that
didn't
reason.
name any names. I'm doing private versus public, and I'm looking for the economic reason or the practical reason for choosing private. Okay. I'm not calling out Microsoft. I didn't mention you once. You just happen to have the mic in your hand. Okay? Oh, by the way, I didn't get an answer yet.
Yeah.
So, look, the answer that I'm going to, I mean, your mind is not going to be blown by my answer, but it's going to be, it depends, right? So what is a public blockchain? So first of all, I would say, let's be clear. Our collective imagination, and for those of us who have gone down the rabbit hole, like the realization of all the things that you can do with blockchain, all of that comes from the possibilities of public blockchain, right? So this whole universe of innovation comes from the realization that we could transact peer-to-peer, and that opened up many possibilities. Now, when the iPhone came out, it was also something mind-blowing in terms of the possibilities offered by it, but it didn't have 3G and it didn't have copy-paste in the text editor. And you could do what you could with that, and some things you couldn't do. And similarly, today, a public blockchain is a blockchain that has between 10,000 and 20,000 nodes, usually, in the case of Ethereum and Bitcoin, a couple thousand miners. So it's not an infinitely public network. It's a network where you have a given number of people that you trust and that you rely on for the security and immutability of the data. A private blockchain today has around a few hundred nodes, usually cannot support more than 30 to 50 miners, otherwise it becomes unstable, but has the advantage of being able to process many more transactions per second. And when you work with enterprise, in many cases you choose Ethereum, for example, because you know that you want your application to ultimately be interoperable with the mainnet. You think of your application as the intranet that will connect with the internet, but you build it on a private blockchain because that's the only way to make it work in the short term.
Thank you, Daniel. So just for the information, I've worked for IBM, so you know that. But first an observation and a question. So if you look at private and public blockchains, private and permissioned blockchains, so to speak, the crypto blockchains and the permissioned ones, then I think they are in some have been so far in a form of co-opetition. They bring each other forward, and there's some competition in between them. But for the first decade, you can say that the private blockchains drove the whole development. It was really Bitcoin, it is Ethereum that really drove everything. And now we are there is something like a midlife crisis, I would say. There is quite a difficulty to scale them and that sort of thing. And so then technologies like IBM embraced, Hyperledger started really to deliver. We really see real blockchain projects like TradeLens with Maersk and the Food Trust blockchain with Hyperledger and many Walmart and many others really taking off, really creating big ripples. Everledger is also part of the family, slightly different, of course. So my question is this a pole position that's going to switch from time to time? Are we going to see the crypto blockchains coming back, or are they losing pace? Is the permission blockchain, is Hyperledger and that sort of technologies, Corda, getting so much traction that is really going to be crypto from now on for the crypto blockchains?
I was just saying there's a tremendous amount of development happening right now, during this crypto winter on some of these public and new protocols that haven't yet been released, that have raised money. And I'm seeing more and more talent coming into the public protocol space. So people who worked on different solutions for the web, who were retired, who I'm getting calls from, saying we have our next idea, our next project. We're going to apply some of the principles we've learned and things we couldn't do with the web that we can now do, given the processing power, the technology, the zero knowledge proofs, the combination of where we are in the development. So I think it will happen. I don't know what I think it's going to happen very quickly, and it goes to Yorke's point of the open source nature of this. We haven't seen anything like this before, and I'd say the pace of development. I actually think the amount of money that went into this sector was a very negative thing for the sector in a lot of ways, because it was a distraction from building. But now that we're kind of back to building and seeing who is really in it for the building and the potential of the technology, I'm seeing a lot of rapid development behind the scenes.
I would say also.
That's true. That's true.
So I'd say also I really commend the progress made by the teams working on private blockchains to show the possibilities offered by the technology. I'm also very grateful to those teams because they provide the best training and recruiting ground for us. And some of our best hires working currently on public blockchains come from those teams that are made their teeth on private blockchain environments.
So one of the things that I would like to leave this discussion with is to change the narrative from public to public-private. I'm just looping back, but I'll give you a little bit more tactical. If I'm an architect, which is where my heritage comes from, and I want to go implement for your client or any client, or Yorke wants to go, we're not going to make any evaluation decisions in a decision tree or an architecture, whether this is public. Yes, you did it at a high level, but what does it mean tactically to the design of it? So here's, I don't want to just complain about what I was saying shouldn't be the right framework without giving you an alternative framework. I think the alternative framework should be, yes, focus on the privacy aspect, but what does that mean? I decompose that into three pieces, and I would have you look at it from these three axes. You have to look at a governance axis, you have to look at an incentivization axis, and you have to look at a data use axis. So if you keep those three axes in your mind, then you're having a more granular discussion than private versus public. And it drives it deeper into privacy. This is a little bit to the point that Yorke started making when he was talking about we put a data matrix together and do all that magic. Salesforce, let me give you an example. That's a pretty big name of a shared kind of an platform. Only 4% of that data is really private and confidential, only 4%. So you have to slice and dice this thing to say what is exactly private, and now how do you want to treat it? Last point, right? Blockchain and AI collectively are finishing what big data movement started. Big data did not have monetization, and that's why getting money out of it was hard. AI is bringing down the cost of prediction, and then blockchain is providing the indelible nature out underneath of it. Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think the reality of, sort of to your point and to your point as well, is that if we did every project and we had our choice as, digital, asset registration people, or blockchain people, we would do it on public blockchain. The reality is we can't get enterprise to do that, right? And if we don't get enterprise to move, then we're not going to get anywhere pretty quick, right? So the whole advent of the consortium blockchain or the private blockchain is to get enterprise to move. So I said this earlier, it is a tool to help them cross the chasm. And when I say cross the chasm, that means there's a future on the other side of that chasm that we believe is different than what we're doing today.
Hi, thanks. Josh Crum from Abex Technologies. I've got a simple premise that was mentioned up there before. I think in 5 to 10 years, a company has to be natively blockchain plus self-sovereign identity, just like you had to be mobile plus cloud natively. As these phases move along. I guess, so the question is around identity, and I feel like there's been some confusion around public, private. I think R3 had some really cool things. I think Uport, I think, Microsoft and some of the work you're doing, but they're all a little bit different. I'm wondering if there's a way that, the identity can be more standardized across all of those, because I think that's the really.
So this was a realization that I had in early 2016, that the great work of companies like Sovereign and Civic and Uport would wind up creating the next Facebook islands, Twitter islands, WeChat islands, WhatsApp islands that don't have any interoperability because there's no standard schema, there's no interoperability protocols that actually work across these. So we got together with all those organizations plus others, and I think there's now about 50 organizations that are part of the Decentralized Identity Foundation. And this is a group that is focused on creating a common schema for DIDs, or decentralized identities, that, for example, if Sovereign registers a DID or Uport registers a DID, and for some reason they don't exist tomorrow, the next company that does exist can still read those identities. And there's a whole lot more that you can find on identity.foundation, or just search for Decentralized Identity Foundation, and you can see the participants in that. What we've seen as examples where new chains have come up, there's a startup out of San Francisco called Occam, and they developed a chain based on the Tendermint protocol. The blockchain data structure is actually not really important for this particular application. It's a public cloud, public blockchain application that uses DIDs to register devices. And so what that means is that they're following the standard, and because they're following the standard, they have complete interoperability with all of the other solutions that are following the standard. So one important part of the Decentralized Identity Foundation standard is, so I've registered my identity in Bitcoin, how do I find it? Or if I've registered my identity in Ethereum, public Ethereum, how do I find it? So they've also created something that's sort of like a DNS, which is called a resolver, so that if I've registered an identity on any chain, if that chain has a resolver, I can now go get that standard format, whether it's a person, institution, or device identity, and actually interoperate with it. So it's I think that work has already been started. So yeah.
I was going to add about the previous point, actually. I think one of the key things that working with a lot of the large organizations around how they can actually use blockchain and how it can be applied within their current business model, governance is a key topic. And until we can resolve that and we can give enough confidence to these enterprises in terms of how that's going to be managed, we won't be able to move past the point that you mentioned earlier.
And so complementing the answer on identity and taking my EU Observatory hat, I'd like to mention that the European Union has a framework for digital identity that is supposed to be interoperable across member states. It's called eIDAS. And they are really, like right now, they are working very, very hard and engaging in extensive consultations to figure out how that framework can be made compatible with multiple blockchain protocols.
Real quick, my closing comments, and just building on wonderful comments. Let me just drive it home on what we are facing over here. Look at everybody's neck. Here's my identity problem, right? There are like half a dozen of these that all of us are wearing around over here. This is kind of, how do we drink our own champagne? And that's because one booth entry, one lounge entry doesn't trust the other entry. And maybe here's a call for action. There's a lot of expertise and mind share just within these 3, 4, 5, 6 lounges over here. And few of us can perhaps get together and maybe set a target for next WEF. How would we create an experiment for identity and have entities that are participating here at Davos and WEF, and invite Sheila, and invite Sandra, and invite Lubin, invite Yorke, invite IBM, invite the startups, and have an experiment and put that in place over here. And then let's see that I have 8 over here. Somebody called, you're looking like a general. And Bruce, I promised you there was a tie-in to this that I had, right? So maybe that's a call for action that I would propose over here, and let's see if we can galvanize around that.
That's a very good idea and a very nice closing.
Massive idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the great panel discussion, and thank you very much for your attention, and have a great evening.